Welcome to this second of two virtual symposia on the role of philosophy in the nursing world. This symposium is a joint endeavor between IPONS and the Center for Nursing Philosophy at the University of California, Irvine. And it's directed, the center is directed by Dr. Miriam Bender, who's also a member of the IPONS Executive Committee. And she and her team have been responsible for organizing the technology behind today's webinar. And we've been told there's 500 participants, and we've just seen in the text box that people are from all over the world. And so really, we're very happy you're all here. Just a note for the Californians that our sympathies are with you, Miriam, trying to do all of this in the middle of what's a terrible situation in California. I mean, everybody's in a terrible situation, but I know California is really struggling. So congratulations on managing all of this with everything else you've got going on. I'd also like to just acknowledge the vision and efforts of Catherine Green, who's our IPONS chairperson, and she's going to talk some at the end or give some closing remarks. She really inspired and supported these virtual symposia, and she's going to be our timekeeper for today. Thanks also to our planning committee who've worked very hard, Dr. Darlene Jansen, Jane Hopkins-Walsh, and Dr. Green. Among the reasons for these virtual webinar that you may or may not know is that the annual IPONS conference that was to be in Sweden in 2020 had to be postponed to this year. And it is going to be June 16th to the 18th in Gothenburg, Sweden. It may be in person, or it may just be virtual, or it may be some of both, but just so you know, you will be able to attend virtually. There's more information available on the website, so you can go ahead and look at the IPONS website and you will be able to get more information on that. So our first symposium, which was in August, was on the role of philosophy in the development and practice of nursing, past, present, and future. And we had such good reviews from that we decided a successor was needed. And we've just all been talking about how exciting it is to have so many people attend. Just as a bit of background on IPONS, the society itself launched in September of 2003 at the 7th International Philosophy of Nursing Conference, which was in Stirling, Scotland. The broad purpose of the society, which we're carrying on today, is to bring individuals from different countries into an international network to promote and support the growing discipline of philosophy of nursing. For this second symposium, we were really fortunate to get a panel of eminent scholars in the discipline. And everyone we asked said yes, which is just fabulous. This is a once in a lifetime panel, I think, of people. So this current symposium is going to explore the issue of what are the current debates in nursing theory, education, and practice related to philosophy. Before I introduce our stellar panel, I'd just like to remind people of a few things. First, this is being recorded, so you should have access to it in a few weeks, maybe sooner than that, I'm not sure. At the end of the panel session, there is going to be a question and answer session, Jane's going to remind you of this in a few minutes about how to do that. If you have a question for a specific panelist, just note for who the question is and we'll try to do it, but there are a lot of you. You're not going to be able to speak in person just because there are 500 of you. And also you will hear a strange little sound towards the end of each speaker's presentation, and that's Dr. Green, who's going to remind them of how much time they have remaining. But I don't think it'll be too distracting. Okay, each panelist is going to speak for 12 minutes, and I'm just going to introduce our panelists briefly. There's a lot more information about them on the IPON's website. And this is in the order of presentation. Dr. Barb Pesut is a professor at the University of British Columbia, Canada, and she's going to discuss claiming the margins, politics and philosophy. Dr. Peggy Chinn is going to be next. She's a professor emerita from the University of Connecticut, USA, and she's going to talk about decolonizing nursing thought. Following Dr. Peggy Chinn is Dr. Sally Thorne, who's professor at the University of British Columbia, Canada, and she's going to talk about conceptual development of nursing's theorizing movement. Following Dr. Thorne is Dr. Patricia Benner, Professor Emerita at the University of California in San Francisco. And she's going to help us in rethinking nursing's pedagogical models in light of current neuroscience epistemologies. And Dr. Martin Lipscomb is going to talk about complexity and ambition in nurse education, and he's senior lecturer at the University of Worcester in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to hand it over now for Jane Hopkins Walsh, who's going to handle the question and answer session. So she's going to give you some tips.
Yes, nothing very complicated. We know that there's sometimes a lot of chat, a lot of passionate ideas. If you could keep the chat in the chat, and that would allow us to have the questions to be able to curate as each panelist is presenting. Because there is an order to the 5 panelists, what we thought is we would take some questions from each presentation. So taking a little bit from the beginning, the middle, and the end. But I will drop my email in chat. And if anybody has any questions that weren't answered in our short time that we have for Q&A at the end, please email me and I will forward them on to the panelists. And with that, I would like to pass to Dr. Barb Pesut to begin our amazing panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you today. So the task that was given to me this morning was to think about how we might reignite an interest in nursing philosophy. And this is actually a really personal question for me. I fell in love with philosophy during my doctoral programming and completed a philosophic dissertation. And I still remember the joy that it gave me to write. I had this burning question, and pondering that question consumed a lot of my day. I sat on my sun deck for days on end, just writing and thinking. And honestly, I can't remember a more satisfying time. Even better, I felt like I was thinking around a particularly complex issue that had troubled me for quite some time. And in doing so, there was just this newfound freedom and clarity. Yet, soon after the completion of my program, I entered a new tenure track position that required national funding. And my love of philosophy seemed like a distant memory as my time and energies were consumed with empirical work. Yet I never lost that love of looking deeper into the thing, whatever that thing was. And I think the projects that I enjoy the most are still the ones where I have to do that wrestling. But now I'm teaching a philosophic course at the doctoral level and needing to engage students with the importance of this topic. And as I taught this last semester, I found myself honestly at a bit of a loss. Together, we were traveling through the history of nursing ideas. And as I watched them over Zoom, I saw them variously engage and then disengage. And they engaged when an idea troubled them, when something in their own lives or world of practice had been difficult to make sense of. They disengaged when ideas became abstract, or when we discussed something that seemed to belong somehow to the dustbin of nursing's historical ideas. And the biggest challenge I encountered was helping them to critique what seemed to be self-evident based upon our currently entrenched nursing ideas. So watching me made me wonder why the incredible fascination that I had developed with philosophy was not afflicting more students in this current generation. So I realized that part of the problem is that really much has changed over the years since I completed my PhD. But I think only recently have I begun to grasp the implications of this revolution of ideas that we've experienced really during my brief nursing career. And these aha moments really have largely occurred by watching the unfolding political context in the United States. It's funny, when you live long enough, you get to see the evolution of culture, and in particular, the logical endpoint of particularly fashionable ideas. And of course, I was a 60s child. I was a child of postmodernism. All of my scholarly development occurred within a context in which common ideas such as truth or morality or democracy were replaced by this, what's been called a hermeneutic of suspicion. We were taught that every idea was actually a will to power, an attempt to establish hegemony that elevated some voices over others. Ours was an ideological revolution in which we believed the more we critiqued, the more we were creating freedom for those less powerful. Ironically, as I've thought about this, while this was really, I think, intended to bring us together in more egalitarian ways, it may have had the unintended consequence of actually fracturing us into identities, a perfect birthing point for some of the populism that we've seen recently. The events unfolding in politics have really illustrated the effects of a deconstructed world, where common ideas of truth and morality maybe can no longer be assumed. Honestly, I spend a lot of my time these days feeling somewhat stunned, as if the world has shifted on its axis. But where am I going with this? My point is that I suspect our philosophic thinking has quietly transitioned into almost exclusively political thinking without us even realizing it. And I think this tendency has infiltrated universities once thought to sort of be these bastions of intellectual freedom. We increasingly live in a time when ideas and language are controlled, and I think nowhere really is that more apparent than in the world of academia. There's immense pressure to approach complex social problems from a single lens. And I think there's little willingness sometimes to think around these problems from various angles and perspectives. The moral path is clear, the language is a bit controlled, and the solutions maybe are deemed to be self-evident. And if you're kind of doubting that, think back to the time when you really tried to challenge a particular line of thinking that's very popular. I'm reading this excellent book by Jonathan Sachs called Morality, and it turned out to be actually the last book of this great thinker. And in it, he talks about our attempts to create safe spaces within the university. And here's what he has to say. There are indeed injustices in society. There are prejudices. There are disadvantaged minorities. Their case must be heard, their battles fought. But that perhaps belongs to the domain of politics. It is not and should not be the domain of academia. There is a difference between truth and power. They have different logics and homes. The university must be the guardian of open debate, courteous argument, civil speaking, and respectful listening. It must provide space for dissenting minds and the voices that challenge our comfortable assumptions. So I think what Sachs is saying here is that within academia, we may have replaced philosophy with politics. Politics starts with a social problem. Philosophy starts with a question. Politics argues often to partisan consensus. Philosophy considers the problem from multiple angles. Politics comes to an agenda. Philosophy comes to another question. And please don't misinterpret. I'm not saying that politics are bad. It's perhaps just not philosophy, although I understand that philosophy is intensely political. And I think the focus on politics is seductive because it's also a means to power in our current climate. To understand what I mean, I would highly recommend the podcast entitled Politics at the Extremes on the Philosopher's Zone that's available through the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. To illustrate the differences between politics and philosophy, they highlight how politicians are rarely, if ever, allowed to change their mind. In contrast, philosophers often make radical about faces in their thinking over their career. They suggest that in our current climate, we become politically powerful by claiming the margins. However, to increase that power, we need to increase the margins more and more. In other words, you have a tendency to build political influence by championing victims, but by doing so, we may at times unintentionally create more victims. So let me now circle back and explain how I think all of this fits with reigniting an interest for nursing philosophy. In the 40 years I've been a nurse, nursing has really, in my opinion, come into its own politically. We understood the great feminist manifesto that the person is political. It began in the ideas of patient empowerment, moved into social justice, and into equities, vulnerabilities, and structural violence. And in focusing so strongly on power and privilege, we've truly embraced the hermeneutics of suspicion and perhaps the politicization of ideas. Further, I think at times we too may have a tendency to claim the margins. But at times I wonder if we've shifted the balance too far toward politics and away from philosophy. Have we traded good questions for social problems? Have we traded healthy debate for consensus? Have we fallen into a space where we believe that nursing may have a viewpoint on what are very complex social problems? And have we inadvertently led students to think that there are no outstanding questions or troubling ideas, but rather political agendas to be realized? I tried to think about the last time I saw a really healthy debate within nursing about very complex social problems, times when nurses really took opposing views and argued through them. And honestly, I couldn't remember a time where our dissenting minds were really challenging some of the underlying assumptions. And I think if in nursing we reflect the ideological differences that characterize society, why are we not seeing more of these debates? So with these ideas in mind, I'm going to actually try something different as I teach next year. I'm going to take some of what has been called our wicked social problems that students are so rightly consumed with and experiment with turning them into philosophic questions. We're going to work on exposing the underlying assumptions of some of our nursing dogma in response to these problems. Perhaps one way to reclaim a love for philosophy is to shake it free from some of its political straitjacket. I've always loved John Paley, not because I like how he takes apart my ideas or our ideas, but because he has always been fearless in doing so. He frees us to think about things differently. And many things trouble students these days, and they have difficulty making sense of them. I think we need to encourage them to fearlessly engage these troubling issues and to do so from multiple viewpoints. And I think we shouldn't assume that what troubles us is exactly what troubles them. They will see things we don't because of our professional enculturation. We're going to give them full permission to ask questions and to think around things that perhaps at times I may not want to hear. I think we need to encourage them toward generativity and wonder. Politics is about moving the world. Philosophy allows us to continue to wonder about the world. It's not just instrumental, it's generative. Now, I'm still trying to figure out how to do that, but I think that's a perfect starting point for some of our conversation today. So thank you very much, and I'm going to pass it on to the next speaker.
That's great, a great start, Barb, and lots of things for us to think about. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Peggy Chinn, who is going to talk about decolonizing nursing thought. Are you there, Peggy? I think you may be muted, Peggy.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So my topic this morning, oh, I'm sorry, I have to start my video. I thought that was all set. Okay, are we set now?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good, thank you. Decolonizing Nursing Knowledge, which in many ways is so kind of like sits in a place somewhere, I hope, in philosophy, but it also is definitely in the political realm. So this will give us a lot of food for thought and discussion as we continue our discussion today. And now what I'm realizing is that somehow I am not, okay, I'm sorry. Here we go. First, I would like to acknowledge the land that I am on. I'm on unceded ancestral homeland of the Muwekma Ohlane people in Oakland, California. And interestingly and gratefully, I'm reminded of this every day because someone has painted on the sidewalk just outside our building in downtown Oakland, stolen land. And I often think of this image that I have on the screen, plus others that are on the website that I have posted here. And I think that people will have access to my slides later if you would like to click on any of the links that are in the slides. First of all, what is colonization? It was originally referred to the process of stealing land, of going into another person's land and saying, this is my land now, without any explanation, and often with a great deal of course, distress and violence. Now it has morphed into also the stealing of, or the taking our, whoever is doing the colonization, taking all of their ideas and ways of viewing the world into the that of other cultures or other peoples, and claiming that our ideas are the right and the good ideas. It is a structure of domination and subordination. It manipulates an entire society to conform to dominant ideals in thought and in action. And the thing that I think is one of the most important things is that it creates antipathy toward an erasure of anything that is other. And that is one of the things that I think we are really trying to question, and trying to, even from the point of view of a philosophic standpoint, is questioning everything that has been taken to be for granted, and examining where did that idea come from, and whose idea really does, whose world does it really apply to? So what is decolonization? It means that recognizing that the cultural, that the constitutive frameworks of power that control thought, and naming them and putting labels on them. One of the things that decolonization is not, it is not really looking at cultural competence or cultural humility. Those concepts actually, to me, get into a dehumanize, are counterproductive to what we need to do, because they create kind of a stereotyping or a idealizing of cultural difference under the guise of having cultural sensitivity. And all of that, I think, are very important for us to question and to really resist. What we really, to me, have to do is to do the hard work to learn to recognize the harm of colonized problems of thought, and engage with people from other thought worlds and yield to their guidance in order to dismantle injustice and inequity, heal the harms that are inflicted by white dominance, which is particularly what we are dealing with in terms of nursing knowledge, and restore the humanity of all. And one of the things that I think comes from this is a greater understanding of the human condition. So to me, we have at least these choices to legitimate and validate non-colonial philosophies. We can try to integrate other points of view, other worldviews within a dominant colonial paradigm that demands articulation into already defined categories of knowledge. And I think that's the temptation that we're looking at. And it's not a bad one. But we have taken so many of our ideas to be universal and then tried to trying to look at, well, for this idea, what is somebody else's point of view about it? The other option is to create new knowledge on the terms of the people, of the frames of reference and knowledge patterns that come from other countries, and then attempt to develop research practice and education that flow from those philosophies. So I'm offering a few modest pragmatic proposals for nursing epistemology and ontology, which I think primarily are situated in the model of staying within our own frameworks, defined frameworks of knowledge. For example, here we're looking at decolonizing the meaning of person, which is a central concept in our nursing structures, theories and philosophies, and really looking deeply into what that idea really means. And we know already that Western ideas of the person are not universal and that we need to really reconstruct those, especially when we are talking about being involved with people from other cultures. One of the things to me that is the most important here is our idea of person as being an autonomous, self-willed being that is free to make choices, which has a lot of problems to me, not only for our well-being, for those of us who come from white culture or from the dominant culture, but for everybody. We desperately need to bring the environment to the center. And in our nursing ways of thought, we have kind of pushed that aside and said, oh, well, environment is really part of society or something different. And it's time for us to really bring this to the center. We have to begin to question and learn to fully embrace the idea of humanization and what this means, and examine, and this is, I guess, one of the areas where some of the political trends of our time really do affect our philosophic thought in terms of dominance and oppression and what it means to dehumanize other people, to not embrace other people as fully human, and what would it mean for all people to be fully human, and then more fully embracing of health as a human right, which, given the structure in which we're situated today, is a very challenging question, and it begins with really embracing or deconstructing and questioning what is health and what does it mean to have that as a human right. So going through a few of these, the meaning of person, I'm sorry, I got a little distracted there. The ability, centering the pod means, you know, taking the person and their ideas outside of this just totally independent, free-willed being into the family, tribe, cohort. And I'm not sure that I know from my standpoint how to say that really well, but one of the things that this really brings as a practical matter is questioning the idea of plagiarism. In our society, in the white Eurocentric way of thinking, which is where the idea of plagiarism or ownership of ideas came from, and acknowledging that there's a lot of work that's been done on what plagiarism means and different types of plagiarism and so forth. But what that does is really, when we examine it, if you center the family and the tribe, you begin to value the practice of repeating, reciting, being able to say the words of other people. As a signifier that you are, your being is embedded in and part of the family, the tribe, the cohort that you belong to, your community. Bringing the environment, physical and cultural, to the center. It's time for us to really start with the land, to really recognize the importance of the world in which we live, seeking actions and words that bring your experience closer to history, to the place, and to the seasons of the earth. We have to begin to emphasize healing the earth and all living cultures as integral to nursing. And this starts with really understanding and questioning what that really means. Humanization is a focus that, to me, shifting on our concepts of is to question the fact of independence and individual free will and choice, to really dismantle racism in all of its forms, to reward cooperation and sharing, dismantling competitive practices, checking white privilege used to dominate and dehumanize. And I realize that this list of possibilities is definitely political. And I really appreciate all that Barb talked about in terms of shifting into the realm of philosophy and how we do that to really examine the, I guess, the ideologies that have been driving so much of what happens in our world and how we even think about the world. And the projects that I've been involved in terms of anti-racism work really does bring me, and I think other people who are involved in this, to the point of really even recognizing what questions we should be asking and what we should be challenging, because so much of our world is taken for granted. And the value of so many of the practices that we engage in, our ways of being in the world, are rooted in these ideals of competitiveness, for example, or self-sufficiency. And when we get to the point that we really can question those, then that will bring us to the point of a deeper understanding of how some of our viewpoints and and our ways of being in the world have shaped and sustained damaging human interactions. And health as a human right is, to me, one of the things that is so important about doing this is that the process of listening is really something that we in the Western Eurocentric world have not mastered nearly as well as we should. But as nurses, we really have a little bit of an advantage in that, because we have understood from the very basic days of fundamentally what nursing is, listening and understanding the point of view of other people is so important. But our listening is still shaped by many of the ideas that we have about what it means to be human, what is health, how do we achieve those ideals, and we definitely have yet to bring the stories of disadvantaged people to the center, and to use those stories to embolden ways to radically change the status quo, and to understand the full range of potential that there is in human experience. I have included, which you won't really be wanting to use on this presentation, but if you get the slides, the sources that I've drawn on in developing some of these ideas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chinn. This is fabulous and great to have these resources. And I'm going to now introduce Dr. Sally Thorne, who's going to talk about conceptual development of nursing's theorizing movement.
Hello, and thank you so much for setting the stage with wonderful ideas, both Barb and Peggy. And I hope where I'm going doesn't sound boring after all the intriguing ideas that you've set forward. My part in this top panel will be to talk a little bit about the nursing theory movement, and to reflect on why it is that that movement is so incredibly divorced from the thing we might call nursing philosophizing, why they're in different textbooks, different conferences, and different conversations. I'd like to start with acknowledging the land that I'm talking from today, the ancestral, traditional, unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And for those of you in different parts of the world that do not do a land acknowledgement, it's very important to many of us, certainly in North America and other places, where we know we have erased a piece of history that we need to be paying attention to. And when we do a land acknowledgement, it's an opening to that recognition that we have that terrible capacity to ignore history, and that there is so much of wisdom to be learned when we begin to open up that recognition. For my part, I want to reflect a little bit about the history, intellectual tradition of nursing, at least a part of it. And I'll begin with where I come from personally. This is a little bit about who I am, who I was, and where I've come from. And when I entered graduate school in 1981, the nursing theory or conceptual model movement was in full swing. I had graduated from a post-basic baccalaureate program that was quite solidly grounded in a very specific nursing conceptual framework. I'd learned enough about that to know that I wanted nothing more to do with nursing models. But graduate education of that era required that you invest a lot of time in learning multiple theoretical approaches, comparing and contrasting them, and trying to determine what might be best suited to any particular patient context or kind of nursing. And to be honest, although I thought that that was a waste of time at that time, I have never regretted what I learned, and eventually came to understand that there was something of value to be gained from examination of that movement. We know that thinking has evolved so much in that last 40 years since I started graduate school. And one aspect, of course, being that wider aspect of health and healing, the thing to which Peggy was simply referring. You know, that mandate toward which nursing has always aspired. We see ourselves as an important part of that human process of health and healing. And yet our definitions of it, our understandings of it have certainly evolved over time and have much more to evolve. And we recognize that. But our nursing theory movement, while it tried very hard to capture some of this and to capture what nursing thought and to articulate what nursing theory was about ideas such as health and our role in it, it took on a nature of its own that might not be well understood to those who haven't had to go through a process of studying it deeply. So I'll just comment a little bit about it. One aspect of it is that in the very early years, before there was things called nursing theories, the language of philosophy does actually turn up in some of the writings. In Peplow's Conceptual Frame of Reference from 1952 and in Dorothy Johnson's 1959 comments, for example, we do see the idea that philosophy might have had some relevance for this discipline of nursing and understanding it. However, that idea quickly drifted away within the world we would call nursing theorizing. A few examples of what I mean by the nursing theory movement. In the 1960s, the work of Orlando, Peplow, Travelby, Johnson. Moving into the 70s with Martha Rogers, Dorothea Oram, Betty Newman, and Sister Callisto Roy. Into the 80s and a little bit into the 90s with Parsi, Margaret Newman, Watson, Leininger. Other names that are very familiar to you. Some of you may know some of them well and may have heard of others. But these are some of the greats of what was a large and powerful theory movement during that time. And back to my own roots, being at the school that I was at, I was immersed in a school that was actually wrestling with the idea of models. And one of my own mentors was Margaret Campbell, who died far too young and didn't write enough, but had very, very big brain cells. And her ideas actually came from Dorothy Johnson, in that we had some new faculty who had just done their graduate education at UCLA and brought class notes from Dorothy Johnson's work up into my school, which had started in the early 70s to create its own model for nursing, which exists somewhere in the history of the tradition. You can find it somewhere. But its characteristic feature was this idea that it awkwardly called psychological environment, which reflected the things we were supposed to learn about everything that might have potential meaning for those we were serving. And these are ideas that have stuck with me and have shaped my lens when I look at theorizing and philosophizing today. But much of that theorizing was enacted in a context in which we might call conventional science. And I think that this is an important insight in understanding why nursing theories took the shape that they did. Over that time, you can see the work moving away from philosophical language and becoming much more of a thing that we might call formal theorizing in more commonly accepted scientific tradition. And for example, you see the names of the theorists were very prominent in the work. Most of them we only know by their names. All the theories had other names as well, but the names we know them by were the names of the originator. And they all explicitly grounded their work in other theories outside of nursing, in the tradition of how the idea of theory was understood at the time. You just don't invent it out of the air, you build it on the work of somebody else, usually in the social sciences, as it turned out. So the theories that were organized according to things like basic human needs often drew on theorists like Abraham Maslow. The interpersonal theories drew on thinkers like Harry Stack Sullivan. And the systems theories drew on von Bertalanffy and Lewin's field theory and that sort of thing. They were legitimized by bringing in grounding that came from outside of nursing. And they all attempted, I think, to tightly define what it was that the discipline was concerned with, how it understood what it was concerned with, and on what basis it could justify, measure, document, or confirm its distinctive contributions. In that way, it was very much using conventional biomedical scientific notions of theory, searching for clear claims about interrelationships and predictions on the basis of those that could be tested and confirmed, with the firm idea underneath it that one or another of these theories would ultimately emerge as the dominant one, shaping all of nursing science. And it used the language of metaparadigm concepts to refer to the 4 basic groupings of things that we theorized about. And perhaps because of the use of the language of metaparadigm concepts, we moved into what were fundamentally, I would call, paradigm wars. Beliefs that these theories were worldviews that were incommensurate with one another. And in nursing, these paradigm wars took the forms of some groups of theorists depicting collections of theories as totality paradigm, representing a particular worldview, and others simultaneity paradigm. A manufactured war, in my opinion, as I think all of these theorists actually were wrestling with how to understand these fundamental questions of the discipline, but they were playing out their ideas in somewhat different ways. And this became problematic, and as I'll point out, I think the paradigm wars are what turned many nurses away from taking nursing theories seriously. Unlike science or philosophy at the time, nursing theory really had no built-in mechanisms for rejecting things we might call falsehoods, tautologies, or irrelevancies. And this was a serious difficulty. And I would argue, you may differ from my opinion with regard to what those irrelevancies or tautologies might have looked like. But I think within the world of nursing theory, there are quite a number of statements that we would not really want to show to the wider world or show to other disciplines, don't really reflect well on how most of us would think about our discipline. And we had no mechanism to challenge them. And although we're beyond those paradigm wars for the most part now, and it's no longer expected that one will dominate, I think we're still caught up to some extent with the idea that this is what theorizing was supposed to have been about. And the most obvious remnant of that, I think, is the concept analysis, which is still ubiquitous as an exercise in most nursing graduate education programs today. As a journal editor, I still get lots of concept analysis papers. And many of these are dealing with ideas as basic building blocks of theory that need to be tied down with antecedents and model cases, essentially for operationalizing them into research applications. This kind of exercise is not a broadening exercise, it's very much a narrowing exercise. And we all look forward in a week or so to the launch of John Paley's new book, which will be reflecting on concept analysis and new ways to think about that. In this audience, I think we can see that this kind of work is a narrowing, synthesizing, codifying kind of exercise, in contrast to the intellectual work that would have us uncritically unpacking the ideas that we're working with, reflecting on what purpose they have served and what they might have obscured, and allowing us to progress our thinking in order to advance the insights that might take our profession forward. And certainly both Barb and Peggy were referring to some of these kinds of ideas. And taking it back, I think, into those meta-paradigm concepts, we can see, I think, within them, within what they were trying to wrestle with, some core ideas that were actually important and useful for the evolution of thinking in our world, if we'd allowed them to move forward. What we call person in nursing theorizing, people wrestle with now in conversations about things like person-centered care. What we wrestled with as health, we think about often as quality of life, and certainly in the medically assisted dying and end-of-life care movement, we are dealing with this all the time, what that means and how to work with it. And I think most importantly, this idea of environment that nursing was so awkwardly wrestling with in those early days, we've begun to understand as language like social determinants of health has become more accessible to us. And by looking at these concepts that those nurse theorists were wrestling with, we can see their efforts in raising the questions that they thought we should be asking. And we haven't really allowed ourselves to move very far beyond that in thinking, what should we be asking today? So I think the paradox really is that our nursing theory movement got us stuck from philosophizing and from fully engaging. Because it was so grounded in science and clinging to the assumptions of some of the conventions of science, such as the idea that one theory or one paradigm of theories would dominate over another, that was the point of it all. And that we need to think about how to move this forward as something more than science. I do believe that in the work of those theorists, there was lots of struggling. By framing it as theory, they went sideways sometimes. But if we look at it as a beginning attempt at philosophizing in thinkers who didn't have formal philosophy and didn't understand, for the most part, what they were doing as philosophizing, we can pull forward some of the values, beliefs, and principles that can be hallmarks for who we are now, how we know things, and how we go forward. I think that they can be very helpful in helping us unpack some of those things that we might consider as nursing's epistemological hardwiring. And I think we can reflect on, because of this, the nature of nursing knowledge, which is not as static and codified. We're not looking for truths for now. We understand knowledge as flexible and infinitely adaptable as it has to be. How do we know what's good enough for now? How do we move things forward instead of nailing down concepts? How do we philosophize and explore the implications of ideas? So nursing theories drew us further away from this kind of philosophizing that we're thinking about today. If we begin to reframe them as awkward attempts at beginning philosophy, I think we can start to move forward what those fundamental ideas are that shape the discipline, even if they were misguided at the time. And I think we can move forward into reflecting on the challenge for the next generation of nursing thought leaders to help us more fully, critically reflect on what it is that they were doing and what it has to do with the understandings of today, so that we can confidently know the nature of nursing, not just blow with the winds of what's politically correct or appealing in the moment, but to understand it as a right and proper part of this understanding of the discipline. The era of formal theorizing, I think, is pretty well over, and we need instead to revitalize philosophical thinking within our academic nursing communities if our discipline is to meaningfully contribute to the evolving complexities of ethics and evidence in this modern world. And I thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, our first three speakers really have opened things up for us, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer session. So thank you very much, Dr. Thorne. And now Dr. Patricia Benner is going to talk to us about rethinking nursing pedagogical models in light of current neuroscience epistemologies. And I'm struck by how all of these are sort of building off each other, if you like. So Dr. Benner, thank you.
Thank you. I'm trying to be seen and heard here. I'm assuming that you can hear me and that the video will follow. These presentations are amazingly integrated, so I will do my best to pick up these wonderful themes because they're so important to the cutting edge thinking of what we're doing now. I'm going to share my screen here if I'm
The green button.
Pardon me, share screen, yes.
Green.
Yeah.
And you have to accept, I think.
Okay, there we go. There we go. So in some ways, there is a strong message of overcoming a representational or Cartesian vision of the mind in each of these presentations. And so I hope to sort of refer back to that. Now I need to move my slides forward, which is my next, okay.
Patricia, I would suggest that you
there we go. Okay. So I'm going to be presenting sort of counter views to Cartesianism, which is a representational view of the mind that holds that we think and learn from formal concepts, ideas, maps, templates, and that the world is mediated or filtered through those concepts. Now, while I am not going to deny that our perception is influenced by concepts, what I am challenging is that the only way that our mind is influenced is through concepts. And if we don't have those formal concepts or ideas or templates in our mind, then we won't notice it in the world. I want to emphasize that we have an effortless, pre-reflective understanding of the self in the world. And that self is primarily a socially embedded self that is a member participant rather than that autonomous self-willed person and isolated individual that Peggy Chinn critiqued. People are always immersed, involved in a meaningful context, and our perception occurs from that context that includes skilled know-how, grasp of meaning directly without requiring those mental templates, concepts, and representations. Now, again, if you think I'm speaking heresy, keep in mind, I'm not saying we aren't influenced by concepts. I'm just trying to get us beyond a kind of totalizing vision of templates and a representational mind, which doesn't match the current neurocognitive science about how we learn or how the mind operates. We have moved from an old-fashioned information processing model and our old-fashioned artificial intelligence model to much more in neurocognitive science, to a neural net notion of learning. And so now you will find many articles and research written on knowing without thinking, and all of this sort of direct apprehension and experiential learning from the world. And in all practice disciplines, that turns out to be really important. So people are capable of reflective, deliberate, conceptual thought. And what I'm arguing for in overcoming Cartesianism, which has pretty well been left behind in philosophy, is that being situated in a meaningful context grounds one in order to be able to engage in abstract conceptual thought. And as educators, when we pass over this involvement in the world and this grounding in practical projects, we harm our pedagogical thinking. And I want to say that our pedagogical thinking in nursing is colonized by Cartesianism, is colonized by this private, self-willed, autonomous, separate, idiosyncratic, psychological self. And the book I would recommend is by Bert Dreyfus and Charles Taylor on retrieving realism, which would encourage us as educators to take much more seriously the background social practices in nursing or any practice discipline that one might teach, and also take a stance of the primacy of engaging and having an involvement, having things matter to one. So concept mapping was mentioned several times, and you can have, I've encountered situations in working with educators where a student will give this incredibly multifaceted presentation of a first-person experience, nursing experience, which taught them so many things, and the teacher will move, okay, let's move that into a concept mapping, and miss all of the narrative, the particular in relation to the general, and to what was going on that was much more relational and practice-based, a shared social practice of nursing than an intellectualist concept base. So it's that constant moving to detachment and standing over against the situation that's so wrong and limiting with Cartesianism. Now, not that detachment and objectivity are not important. They are, of course, but they're not our most primary mode of being. The other book I would recommend is The Language Animal by Charles Taylor, which talks about the immersion and also in firsthand experience and the role of narrative understanding and story. Our clinical reasoning is best captured not by algorithms, although they can give a pale image, but most clinical situations are multi-determined, multi-causal, and Taylor, who I worked with for many, I have worked with for many years, uses the example of someone who is an embodied intelligent agent at the scene of a car accident can give a much more cogent and fitting explanation than any single algorithm. But yet we tend to be so scientized and colonized by science, to use Peggy's term, that we ignore any discourse between the particular and the general. And that's part of the problem with the Cartesian or representational view of the mind. But if we start with care, concern, and relatedness as constituting our world, all of these ontological constitutive aspects of being in the world that come prior to epistemology and shape our epistemology, we can counter this, and it's much closer to what we're about as a social practice of nursing in health and healing. So just some of the tenets that are that come from this care, concern, relatedness ontology is that life worlds are shared, not private, not merely subjective and encapsulated. So this atomistic, self-willed, private, idiosyncratic individual is jettisoned. And this is because common meanings, language, culture, history, practices, skilled know-how are shared. They don't have to be explained away by subjective meanings or subjective attributions. Clearings or disclosive spaces are also shared. What it means to be democratic, what it means to be a nurse. And one of the problems with an intellectualist formal concept, formal theory approach is that these shared practices become unarticulated and passed over. Other examples, of course, are sports that we fully share in the social practices, understand the rules as participants and fans, and then being collectively moved by events. I would never want to claim that in saying that engagement and involvement are primary, that we don't need the critical hermeneutics of suspicion, that we do not need to be able to discern when we're being caught up in a wrong-headed movement. My American political experience right now is too painful not to bring that up, as other speakers have. But all practices, especially professional practices, depend on taken for granted shared practices of what it means, for example, not to leap in and try to take over another person's decisions or ignore and not listen to their concerns. We need to be able to articulate these practices when they are situated and when we confront them. And so if we move from the student's firsthand relational encounter with the patient to mere concept mapping, we cover over these taken for granted shared practices that began a long time ago and have accrued and become enriched. Stories and tactful inquiry about concerns, meanings, and informal understandings of the illness causes and recovery of our patients can disclose ways of being in the world and enclose and uncover situated possibility. Because what we have, unlike some of the ways our formal, our Cartesian understanding of that self-willed, autonomous, control-oriented individual, we never have radical freedom. All we ever have is situated freedom and situated possibility. And that's so helpful in terms of working with patients who are going through the not me, not here, not now, horrible place of despair and suffering that often comes with great loss and illness. I'll give you an example of the kind of shared participant member stance of the person in this view. For patients who have memory problems, conjuring up or evoking their points of enchantment, their lived salient personal knowledge and meaningful history, if we conjure that up for them, we can allow the person access to memories and meanings that they can't themselves conjure up. So this is a vision of shared meanings, of distributive cognition, that's very useful to our practice. One of the one of the major fallacies of mediated or Cartesian epistemology is that pure intentionality, that is, that we could ever be engaged in the world or operate in the world as just a private, subjective, autonomous person standing over against an objective world. That kind of pure intentionality and mediated epistemology or Cartesian epistemology leave out the precognitive, direct perceptual grasp of reality and other forms of intentionality, such as meaningful, purposeful, and salient skill behavior, self-defining commitments in particular situation, and so much related to our member participant in actual situation. There are 5 key aspects of this view of non-mediated, which is Charles Taylor's term for Cartesian epistemology. One is embodied intelligence and agency. So going back to the intelligent embodied agent in the car accident, they have a sense of what came first, how it impacted something else, and a much richer account of the multiple sources of causality in a particular event than you can get from single algorithms about single aspects of the event. This shared, taken for granted background meanings that we as Cartesian subjects have allows us to articulate, communicate, and understand one another. For example, empathy is rooted in that awful Cartesian history that imagines that we have to ferret out the private imagination and experience of a single individual, rather than much of our background meanings are shared and we have access to them as ones who dwell in the same culture. Salience in the situation, and this is a really important educational perspective for me, is that one of the things that we must do better job of is respect for coming to situations where some things just stand out as more or less important. We know this practically, but formally and theoretically, we are colonized by Cartesianism. So we don't grasp how important having some things stand out as more or less important, and how that determines our attunement and perceptual grasp. So when we come to...
Thank you, Patricia. We'll have to wrap up soon.
Okay, I'm sorry, I got too excited. Okay, so the other aspect is that concern involvement organizes and directs perception and understanding. And I'm going to skip over these modes of engagement, but we can think of the ready-to-hand skillful coping that we often don't articulate in our teaching, and then breakdown situations where we have to notice things that aren't working. And then finally, the most far away from our direct immersion in reality is the present at hand, which is very useful in explaining our world and in correcting breakdowns. The three current relevant issues, related philosophical issues, is I would point out there are more, is the outdated use of information processing views, and our current state board exam is based on that outmoded, old-fashioned artificial intelligence and outdated cognitivism from a neuroscience, neurocognitive science. And the problem of imagining that all knowing and learning must be organized by formal concepts. Okay, I will stop there. I'm sorry, I got a little carried away. Thank you.
So that was fabulous also, Dr. Benner, and I can't help but think how actually each of these presentations are fabulous in their own way of making us think about things, and especially like the fact that you brought in this idea of what we know from cognitive science about how the mind works and how we work as humans. So thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Martin Lipscomb, who's from the University of Worcester, and he's going to talk about complexity and ambition in nurse education. Thanks, Martin.
Hello, can you hear me, Pam?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Right. Are you able to turn video on at your end?
I'm not sure. Miriam, can you turn Martin's video on? Let me just have a go.
I can see him here.
It says his video's on.
Okay. Let's just...
Patricia, would you mind stopping here? I'm going to stop screen share. That's the problem. There we go.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, there you are.
Right. Well, okay. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be invited to be present, and I've really enjoyed listening to my fellow panelists. In the time available to me, I would like to talk about complexity and a few of complexity's potential implications in university nurse education. My contribution is therefore, compared to those of my fellow panelists, a tad prosaic. I'm going to start from the assumption that nursing and nurse education describes a complex undertaking. This simply states the obvious. However, I don't think educators always acknowledge complexity, and if they were encouraged to do so, my suspicion is that educators would collectively find themselves challenged in interesting ways, ways that might and perhaps should prompt a more ambitious line to be pursued when interacting with students. Of course, complexity is a woolly term, and complexity isn't simply complication. Nonetheless, the descriptor, if imprecisely, captures problematic issues that overlap and interleave. And to illustrate what I mean, I'll use an example. So, true story, at short notice, a colleague is asked to deliver a single standalone session to a reasonably large group of undergraduate students on the subject of health promotion. In her presentation, only relative risk ratios will be discussed. Absolute risk will categorically not be mentioned. And just to be clear about the difference, if the absolute risk of developing a disease is 2 in 100 and some behavior increases relative risk by 50%, that 50% relates to the 2. So the absolute increase in risk is 50% of 2, which is 1. Okay, what's my colleague doing? I think we can identify a range of factors, some probable, some potential, that together may be influencing her decision making. Each has philosophic implications, each feeds into the other. First, my colleague may be restricting what she is talking about to meet professional expectations. That is, in the UK, health promotion tends almost always to rely on relative risk figures. However, should she not at least keep open the possibility of differentiating between her role as a nurse, a member of a profession, and her role as a university lecturer? Personally, even if my profession adopts a particular approach to nurse-patient interactions, an approach reflecting wider policy decisions, as a lecturer, I don't consider myself duty-bound to limit teaching to meet professional obligations. So I would introduce students to relative and absolute risk ratios, and I would invite them to consider using both ratios when discussing risk with patients. Now, in this particular instance, I suspect no one will be particularly bothered about the profession-lecturer distinction being made, and of course, my assumptions might be disputed. However, in an edited book coming out hopefully later this year, in my chapter, I explore tensions between how, as educators and how, as nurses, we might engage differently with the idea that pain is what the patient says it is. And in that instance, the distinction being drawn becomes much more visceral. Returning to the example in hand, second, my colleague is possibly avoiding absolute risk because she's concerned that students might become confused if they encounter too many statistics. A great deal of research concludes that many, not all, but many nurses find statistics and math difficult. If, as an experienced educator, my colleague anticipates student confusion when statistics are discussed, if for that reason she avoids talking meaningfully about statistics, then we should acknowledge a serious problem, a problem of ability. Statistically illiterate or statistically challenged students will not only face problems engaging with the reasoning underpinning health promotion, presumably they also confront hurdles when it comes to evidence-based practice more generally. These students are unlikely to be able to make much sense of, for example, quantitative research, and thus we here confront an epistemological issue with practice implications. And as an aside, within the UK, during recruitment, we take into account the values that potential recruits say they hold. However, recruiters pay scant attention to measurable or proven statistical acumen, so these problems are hardly unfathomable. Third, the story speaks to professional values. Nurse leaders advance an enormous number of claims regarding the values that allegedly nurses hold or should hold. I think many of these claims lack credibility, albeit that many of the values propounded are ones I accept. Nonetheless, many nurses assert that they value and seek to promote patient autonomy. And with this in mind, why is my colleague emphasizing relative risk ratios, which can sound scary, in preference to absolute risk, which may be less intimidating? Could it be that patients who are provided with relative and absolute risk ratios might not behave in ways deemed appropriate? Arguably, nurses who only talk about relative risk might act or appear to act manipulatively and paternally. They potentially deny patient autonomy by undercutting the ability of patients to make fully informed decisions. Now, paternalism can be defended, yet the arguments involved in this defense trample over a value, autonomy, many nurses say they prioritize. And so potentially the example throws into relief complex tensions between what we say we value and possibly how we act. Following on from this fourth, the story could make us think about the meaning of health and the relation of health to a life well lived. A good life isn't one that minimizes risk-taking in all and every situation. And health is not, and nor should it be always and necessarily, the only thing people value and seek to maximize. Health professionals can't presume they know best, and if nothing else, crude versions of health promotion ignore the self-evident truth that individuals take different positions on the risks that they're prepared and indeed want to accept. Fifth, in her lecture, my colleague will have brought together ideas taken from multiple fields of inquiry. Thus, nursing claims, sensibly, legitimately, to have an interest in knowledge derived or taken from an array of activities and disciplines. For example, in addition to what might be termed practical or situated understandings, nurses engage with and require proficiency in knowledge derived from physical and biological science, social and psychological science, and moral and human science. Knowledge derived from all of these sciences play a part in health promotion. And in this confabulation, connections between distinct fields of knowledge are made. However, problematically, long-standing and nuanced arguments surround tensions between, and here I simplify for the sake of argument, relations between the physical or experimental sciences and the human and moral sciences. And these debates explore ideas about what counts as knowledge and truth, as well as the ends or purposes to which knowledge or truth can be put. And hence, in a discipline such as nursing, a discipline that aspires to bring these knowledge forms together and instrumentally or purposefully to apply them, nurse educators ought, maybe, to have a view on discussions about, for example, the unitary or non-unitary nature of science, as well as whether or to what extent logical connections might or might not be sustainable between these fields and forms of understanding. Now, having a view here might be important. The position we take on such matters, and ignoring them is a position, the position we take presumably influences how we teach and also how we conceptualize links between taught content and clinical practice. The theory-practice divide articulates, in part at least, the difficulty of connecting knowledge derived from universalizing theory with the messiness of context-laden reality. Linked to this, we might also think about differences in causal claims that are permitted within and between the various branches of knowledge and understanding. So generalized causal claims, such as smoking causes cancer, and singular causal claims regards, for example, an instance of smoking or an individual smoking are difficult, they may be impossible to square. Yet in a practice-based discipline such as nursing, educators like my colleague link theory with practice, and as part of this linkage, just as she will implicitly, if not explicitly, have a view on science's unitary or non-unitary nature, she will in all probability have laced together general and specific causal explanation, but possibly she might not have considered whether these linkages are defendable. Okay, this one example story throws out lots of things to think about, and insofar as the topics raised interconnect or interleave and are problems, I consider them complex problems. In my view, nurse educators don't adequately engage with complex issues of the sort described. Indeed, we gloss complexity. I also suppose this lack of engagement leads educators to be less ambitious in their interactions with students than they might otherwise be. For example, failing to introduce students at an appropriate level, using appropriate language to questions around the unitary or non-unitary nature of science and/or difficulties in connecting general with specific causal claims at an appropriate level using appropriate language means students cannot even begin to think about such issues. However, I'm not criticizing individuals. University-based educators do their best to produce accredited learners, and the work this generates and all the associated admin and paperwork that dominates everyday activity. Further, insofar as course requirements are set and steered by external regulatory bodies when it comes to determining what is taught and how teaching occurs, educator hands are often metaphorically tied. Further, within the academy, relative under-resourcing, bloated curriculums, time scarcity, diverse student body, variable educator ability, and the legitimate requirement that subjects be abridged to aid digestion all contribute to the flight from complexity. Here, however, in the remaining seconds, I'd just like to mention one important element in this flight, and that's nurse educators' lack of subject expertise. University nurse educators tend, entirely sensibly, to be nurses. However, removed from practice, clinical or field-specific knowledge quickly ossifies, and when nurse educators introduce students to ideas derived from the disciplines of biology, pharmacology, sociology, psychology, ethics, etc., that is, knowledge derived from the sciences and forms of understanding referred to earlier, subjects with extensive hinterlands of dynamic, evolving understanding, then because they are primarily nurses, educators will not also be subject experts, if by expertise we somewhat tautologically mean someone who has a higher degree or even just a degree in the non-nursing subjects being taught. So beyond early year introductions, and certainly when we're talking about postgraduate study, this lack of subject expertise presumably matters. Generalists cannot do everything equally well, and this isn't an attack upon professionalization or professionalism, it's just a truism. So in conclusion, the woolly concept of complexity might give coherence to some, if not all, of the difficulties university nurse educators confront. And while a great deal of excellent educative practice takes place, to restate, failure to engage with complex issues means educators are not perhaps as ambitious and effective as they possibly could be. Thinking about these issues raises problems with philosophic content, and these things are worth considering. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Martin, as usual, with food for thought and exploding our minds a little bit. Also implications, I think, in there for the education of educators, the education of nurse educators, perhaps. But I'm going to hand it over. I was going to ask a question to the panel, but I think it would be better for us to hand it over to the question and answers session. So I'm going to have Jane Hopkins-Walsh take the lead from now on. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. That was, there's a lot of Twitter chatter happening. People are very, very excited about the content that you've raised here. And I think my job, you know, with some other people behind the scenes here is we're trying to see how to synthesize the questions. So I think since our first panelist was Dr. Pesut, we would like her to turn on her camera and reply. And perhaps I'll ask Peggy also, if Peggy is still connected, to put on her camera. Regarding the margins between philosophy and politics, many of the questions that you can see in the Q&A questioned a clarifying stance on can philosophy and politics be clearly separated and distinguished, and what are the consequences? And some of the words that I pulled out from other questions that might relate to this is like reflecting on the role of positionality of nurses, you know, in this whole discussion about politics and philosophy while attempting to decolonize nursing thought. So, you know, neoliberalism, Cartesianism that were brought up in others. And then, you know, education and what is the role of educators. So with those points in mind, those dots of connection, perhaps Dr. Pesut can begin, and then Dr. Peggy Chinn can comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. I really wasn't trying to say that politics and philosophy can be neatly separated. And I for sure wasn't saying that we need to drop one in favor of the other. I think what I'm really arguing for is a really strong balance. And I think I'm arguing against a particular type of politics that we've seen a lot of recently. And so I'll characterize what I see as some of the problematic pieces. And one is this idea that we choose a position and we can't change our mind. So, I mean, and Peggy, you followed up on this beautifully in talking about how, you know, as humans, we're marvelously complex and we have to think about this differently. We don't settle in one place. We're growing people. Politics that tends to settle on a simple solution rather than understanding that every complex social problem we're struggling with right now has no simple solution, but a political standpoint, because of the way our politics is structured, wants to focus in one area to convince us it can be solved simply. And so I see philosophy as needing to push us back from that and look around a complex problem from multiple angles. The tendency toward binary. You know, we tend to look at groups in a particularly complex situation and even just subtly in our mind, unintentionally assigning good and bad to particular positions rather than hearing a whole group. And I think this whole idea of the loss of a civil conversation, the idea that we've fallen toward this idea of cancel culture, overriding intent into people's conversations. And so really needing to stand back again, understanding how to conduct civil conversations in a way that we understand the complexity of being a human being in a society that's crying out for our political intervention. So I'll just go that far because I'm sure there's many other questions and comments from other panelists. So thank you.
Thank
I
you.
would just, yeah, I totally agree with what Barb has said, and just add that one of the things that has really emerged for me in terms of the anti-racism work that we're doing is the importance of moving into different spaces. Places and interacting with people who do think differently, who do have a different worldview, and just being there and just listening. And it's only through that, I feel, that you can really acquire a deep understanding of the limitations of your own worldview and the ways that you think about things. The opportunities for that in nursing are really quite limited because our systems are so white dominated. Our nursing classes, our nursing faculty are still, we can't stay in those places and begin to examine our worlds from a different point of view.
Thank you. And yes, some of the things that came out in the questions were the extra emotional labor that Black, Indigenous, people of color have to do within these questions,
Yes.
within these spaces. And, you know, really, I think continuing those discussions in forums like this are extremely valuable. So while I have you both here, we have a question for Peggy, and perhaps Barb, you could comment after. What efforts do you know, Dr. Chinn, that have been done to decolonize traditional metaparadigm concepts and linking possibly to decolonization with an ethical lens?
I myself am not familiar with any formal undertaking along those lines, but it needs to happen. But as white people in Eurocentric spaces, we cannot really do that work. Or we might be able to participate in it, but we have to find ways to be part of, to really make it possible for people who can do that work and then be willing and open to taking it in for ourselves.
Thank you. Any additional thoughts, Dr. Pesut? Especially, there seem to be a lot of questions around education. I think maybe many in our audience are educators and hoping to link some of these thinking issues that we're bringing up today to the classroom and how to move these thoughts forward. So do you have any additional comments regarding education?
I think one of the things that's really important is I've been thinking about how to decolonize the educational space is to really, when we bring students together, to bring them around complex issues that may not put people who feel on the margins in the hot seat, if you know what I mean. And so I think that there are ways to bring concerns that come to all of us. And for example, you know, Dr. Thorne and I are doing some work in medical assistance in dying right now. And so we're having the privilege of just interviewing people across a whole spectrum of ethical and moral positioning in relation to what has become, you know, quite a controversial practice in Canada. And what's really illuminating in that work is as people coalesce around an issue rather than around a particular person, they're able to talk about their positionality and all of the things that they've brought to this particular complex issue in nursing that informs their ethical positioning. And so I think it's part of thinking about how do we create safe spaces in the classroom so that nobody feels like they're on the hot seat, and becomes sort of the focus of the attention of how are we going to make you feel better about this particular situation. And I think that's a tricky thing to do.
Thank you. So I would like to invite Dr. Sally Thorne to turn on her camera, and perhaps Dr. Benner to answer some questions that we tried to curate about this idea of Cartesianism and nursing theory. And Dr. Miriam Benner also would like to be part of this. How to get past Cartesianism within nursing theory and philosophy, because I think that, you know, it links also to some of the other ideas we just discussed with the first respondents.
Maybe I can just make a few comments, and I think this is very much a Patricia topic. I think it's helpful for us to look at nursing theory in its time and with what I'm arguing were some misguided views. Of course, also look at it within its context of the political ethos and the many layers of unawareness, we might call it, of its time. And because it was organized towards science, it leaned toward codifying, and it leaned toward an endpoint, which was exactly not the kind of conversation we need to be having today. And so that's essentially the main point I wanted to make, that we have to understand that philosophizing is not a codifying. It should not be an elite conversation that only those who have a PhD and have taken a philosophy of science course can engage in our discipline. Obviously, it should be, that might be a place where you think about your thinking differently than you have previously, but that conversation needs to go far beyond, which is, I would argue, in the tradition of nursing always, to allow ourselves to be attached, even in the biomedical science world, to a specialist elite conversation that a radiation oncologist is having, and then move that into the world of patient, family, colleagues, etc. So I see that function as one that is part of our ontological nature. So I'll leave the Cartesian aspect of that to Patricia, but I do believe that rather than ignoring and wiping out recognition of that nursing theory era, there was a lot of very fine minds that were putting their attention to trying to wrestle with some of these issues, misguidedly caught in misbeliefs, and yet within it all, that sense that we in nursing have this motivation that we can continue in conversations like this to make more accessible to a wider group of people, to open up, to allow us to be wrestling with the fundamental ideas we need to wrestle with right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. I found your presentation so informative. I was trying to really point out what has become the sort of folklore and folk psychology of Cartesianism in nursing. It's as if when we entered the university, and this is ersatz personal history, but when we entered the university, we promised to be so intellectual, so conceptual, And I once did a presentation in Bern, Switzerland, because the nurses had been going to the university for all those years, and the university had been saying, show us how conceptual you are, show us how intellectual you are, and then we'll let you in. And my presentation to them was, but you really messed up in law and in medicine because you couldn't understand practice, and you couldn't understand practice as a way of knowing in its own right. And that's very much linked with Cartesianism, of this view of knowledge only counts if it's general. And with a practice discipline, you have to have a dialogue between the particular and the general, because practice is always such a dialogue. And it's really crippling when you don't have articulation of frontline knowledge. The example that always comes to me, is just historical, was when the astronauts were circling the Earth and they look down and they see all the swirls in the ocean. They had no preconception of that. They had no mental model of that. It was there. And a lot of things that you encounter in the complex nursing practice are there, open to be discovered and articulated. And you need more than snapshot reasoning. You need more than fixed accounts. You certainly need more than oppositional thinking. And I guess why I get so exercised about this, and I do, is that our pedagogies are all unquestionably based on a representational view of the mind, and it's crippling our teaching of the practice. It's devaluing practice. I think it's directly contributing to education that does not really prepare nurses to be practice ready. So I can stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a little bit under 10 minutes left, about 8 or 9 minutes, and I'd like to invite Dr. Lipscomb back. You know, this whole idea of complexity and complex issues, I think, connects very much to the other speakers as well, and politics and philosophy. But we had a specific question for Dr. Lipscomb, which is, as you were analyzing how complexity is avoided in nursing education due to those various reasons you identified, what are some ways to address this? What do you think works best? And also, if you could comment on a link to clinical practice, because some of the other questions also brought up issues of, you know, bringing some of these ideas back to the clinical setting.
Okay, addressing complexity, first of all, I'd pick up on some of Sally Thorne's comments, or my interpretation of where she's going to with the idea of open conversation that doesn't need to be concluded. And that's something that I very much agree with her is very important. It's also something which is quite difficult for a discipline such as nursing to hold open the idea that many of the things we'd like to talk about, many of the things which really matter to us, don't lend themselves to simple remedy and immediate conclusion, because for practitioners on, you know, doing nursing, they need to know what to do. They have to act in the world, and the very last thing that they want or need is the idea that they could or should engage in an ongoing, rolling, open conversation when they need to act. And yet I think Sally's spot on when she says that many of the things which were, I'm putting words into her mouth here, I don't know if she's still there and able to come back in, but many of the things which really matter and that we need to get to grips with certainly can't be answered. These are open, unending questions. And that's actually the engagement with them and the attempt to, it's not my phrase, but vex ourselves with greater degrees of clarity, that where the benefit lies or comes from. What was your second question about? Sorry.
Just like how to link some of these questions back to clinical practice for nurses who are, you know, in the clinical setting.
Well, I think if you're going to suggest to Well, okay, here's an example. There are trends and fashions, aren't there, in the subjects that students pick up and develop. And recently we've had a trend where students wanted to do, undergraduate students wanted to do their dissertation on witness resuscitation. And they keep framing their questions as ought or should questions. They're really interested in the ethics of this thing. And then they turn to the research literature, which tells them what is the case. So they might learn from the research that such and such a percentage of nurses think it's a good idea or a bad idea, but that can't, in principle, conclude the question from an ethical or moral or evaluative standpoint. They're completely different things. And I think the use of some of these ideas would be to help them understand why the types of question that they're interested in, and nurses are often interested in questions of value, questions of morality, can't be concluded by a turn to the science. Science can help us understand things. It can help us, it will obviously informs our thinking all the time, but it won't conclude those types of question. And Patricia's interest in Cartesian thinking, I thought was really interesting, but I would frame it from that way of looking at things, that, you know, we have these different questions, we've got these different ways of understanding the world, and we sort of move too quickly towards assuming that a certain form of science is all we should look at. That wasn't a very good answer. I'd need more time to think about it. I'd need more time for a good answer to that one.
Thank you. That was excellent. So I would like to invite Dr. Pam Grace back. We have about 5 minutes left, Pam, if you're still here and wanted to turn your camera on, and we can ask all of the panelists to turn their camera on, and I'm going to turn mine off. And again, I will drop my email in chat for anybody that has specific further questions. I'm happy to facilitate that. Thank you again.
Thank you. And I know there's a lot more, there are a lot more questions, and, you know, as you've given me an awful lot of food for thought. And one thing I was thinking about when you were talking, Martin, was just this idea when I teach students, even grad students, ethics for their advanced practice settings, how by actually questioning and opening things up, they often can get, and listening to their fellow students, they often get disoriented, and sometimes they get distressed about it. And I have to sort of help them think about, you know, what we're doing is just unpicking things that we took for granted. And that's not to say everything's open for us to think about. What we're really doing is saying, well, we know that isn't so, but then, you know, sooner or later in thinking about things, you do come to some kind of equilibrium. But it is very tricky often for students to open their minds and question assumptions. It's really just a comment. I'm not saying that you want to answer that. But.
Well, I think we have talked about this a long time ago, and I would disagree with you. I think ultimately everything is up for discussion within an academic setting at an appropriate level, using appropriate language, but recognizing, as you say, that at the end of that, there are still things we need to come back to. But I wouldn't want to take anything off the table as being untalkable.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean it like that. I didn't mean that we take it off the table, but I'm just that when one thinks for oneself about something and is open to questioning everything, at some point one does start to understand what one doesn't think is so. For example, one wouldn't think slavery was okay. We can take that off the table, but you still have open questions about other things. So it's more about more concrete things. But yeah, we always have good debates, and I won't take up any more time with that. But I do want to thank all the panelists for really giving us a lot of food for thought, opening up this for further conversation, and hopefully we can carry on this in June if we get to go to Sweden, which would be lovely. And if we don't get to go in person, at least we can have some online discussions. And I'm actually now going to just thank everybody and turn it over to our chairperson of the International Philosophy of Nursing Society, Dr. Catherine Green, but not without many thanks again to Miriam for organizing this and being our technological expert that she had to learn, but she did it, and it's been a great opportunity. So, Catherine.
Myself. Oh, wow. Thank you. I knew this was going to be a great conference. I just knew it, but I didn't know how great it was going to be. I've just been blown away. Well, of course, we are deeply indebted to our panelists, and I am so honored to be on the same virtual stage with them. I just can't tell you. Dr. Pesut, Dr. Chinn, Dr. Thorne, Dr. Benner, all names and people whose writings have informed my thinking for many, many years. And Martin Lipscomb, how could I leave that name off? Challenged me, provoked me, and so on. Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, like Pam, I want to say what an honor it is to me to be able to work with in IPON's Pam Grace and Miriam Bender and Darlene Jansen, who's been in the background, but very active in the background, and Jane Hopkins Walsh for her very good job of running the question and answer. It's really been wonderful. As our panelists have really pointed out to us, there's a lot to do. I mentioned in the opening of our first virtual conference that nursing is about practical action, and philosophy is really about stepping back from action in order to think deeply and systematically about the nature of that action and about the people who are involved in it. So as our panelists pointed out, these past few months with COVID-19 have been truly horrifying. Many of our nurse friends and colleagues have been and still are on the front lines, risking and with frightening regularity giving their lives to the gravely ill patients who are presented to them. And to me, that begs the question, what does nursing philosophy have to offer them? Many people think that philosophy is about concepts and ideas, glorified navel gazing, if you will. But in fact, philosophy is thinking about the reality that is in front of us today. The fact that our healthcare world is changing rapidly and radically around us at this very moment. The often ignored reality of how our body speaks to us, how our world determines us, about the brutality of racism and colonization that occur in our healthcare world, about the complexity of the world that we live in, the complexity of the science, big data, social polarization. And our problem then is about how to best prepare nurses to face this reality. These discussions reinforce my long-held view that nursing is essentially philosophic. Essential because it is my view, every nursing interaction raises fundamental human questions. Questions about the society and where our patients fit in the society and where we fit in the society. Questions about life and death. So the philosophic part of it is because this interaction happens in the context of healthcare issues that present what I call existential threats to the person, to their livelihoods, to their ways of life, threats to their very being. The first and continuing questions of philosophy are about the meaning of life, about the reality or the necessity of suffering, the meaning of death, and those sorts of things. They're always present here in nursing interactions. Why me? Isn't there something you can do? What happens next? Suffering, pain, death, life, and the existence of a higher power, these constitute what I call the 800-pound gorilla in the middle of our nursing world. They're even there in the most innocuous sports exam. What happens if I don't pass this exam and I can't play soccer? What happens if I have something seriously wrong with me? And they're certainly there in the tests, the diagnosis, and the treatment of COVID-19, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, everything. Now, because nurses are the people who are the most direct and in most continuous contact with patients, as our patients grapple, either explicitly or implicitly with these questions, their questions become ours. So long ago, we decided in nursing that we weren't training nurses in skills, but we are hopefully educating them to think clearly, carefully, and systematically about the issues that confront them today and prepare them for those new issues about which we know almost nothing that are going to confront them tomorrow. So these issues almost certainly include the increasingly complex understanding of science and technology that are facing us. And we just saw some of the problems with technology that we are grappling with, and they're going to get more difficult as time goes on. There are also the problems that science tells us about the human body. And while we've been talking about problems with how we've maybe scientized nursing into binary issues and so on, it's still the case that understanding our body, both from the point of view of science and sociology and ethics and so on, it's that body that initially brings people into our world, at least often. And so it seems to me that nursing education then still requires the best of chemistry, pathophysiology, biology, and the social sciences as a beginning. But then, as Barb Pesut suggested, and as others have suggested, these all need to be grounded in what it means to be human, what it means to be a member of the human, what I think of as the one human family, and how members of our various communities around the world and over centuries have thought about these perennial human questions. So again, there is much to do. There are many questions and many ways to think about it, which is what IPONS is about, is bringing people together to think clearly, carefully, disputedly about these kinds of questions. So we hope that you will join us, if you're not already members of IPONS, as we work together to try to meet this future. If you are interested to join IPONS, please look us up at ipons.online. That's ipons.online. We would love that you would be included in this conversation. There are many smart, committed nurse thinkers who are out there in the world who are not necessarily a part of any organization, who need to be a part of this discussion. So we hope that you will join us. And now, speaking of smart, energetic, clear thinking people in the world, I'm going to turn the program over to our co-host, Dr. Miriam Bender. Thank you.
I don't know about clear thinking, but anyway, I just want to say it has been an absolute honor and a pleasure to co-sponsor this event. Thank you to Martin and Patricia and Sally and Catherine, yourself, and Barb and Peggy and Pam and Jane and Darlene for making this happen. There have been nothing but positive, encouraging feedback in the chat. The questions have been incredibly stimulating. I've gone ahead and noted them. We'll try and engage them in modalities that are yet to be thought of. Please help us out in this. We talk about humanism, but in this post-human technological interactive world, I'm sure there's ways we could do this. The Center for Nursing Philosophy here at UCI is also here with its mission to foster philosophy in all its modalities for nursing, and we have lots more events. People were asking about it, so please go to IPONS, go to the Center for Nursing Philosophy. There's lots more planned, and this has been fantastic. Thank you to everybody.
And just one more thing, if I could say before we go, many people have asked that we do something like this again. So keep up with IPONs and keep up with our Twitter and so on to look for the next one. There will certainly be one. Thanks again.
Bye. Hi, Catherine. I'm trying to get the chat recorded.
Okay, good.
But
there are still a few people. I was not going to turn myself off until I kind of knew there's still a few people signed in to us. So we're still live.
I am not able to copy and paste the chat. This is
okay. I'm gonna try to do that then.
Can you try and do it? Yeah.
I'm gonna try.
Okay, select all. Okay, wait. Select all. Copy.
Okay.
It's not working for me. I don't know why.
Okay, hang on a minute. Just hang on. Oh boy. How can
I've been able to get all the Q&As, so I have all the questions on a document, but it's the chat. And usually there's a save to file, but I don't have that option. Select all.
Okay, now here we go. Let me see what I've got here.
Jump to chat view. Oh, I'm going to stop recording. How about that?
Right, do that.